In the summer of 1871, a young seamstress named Delphine Boissou was due to testify at a parish courthouse along the lower Mississippi at 7 in the morning. She never arrived. The bailiff discovered her boarding room locked from within. Her dinner sat untouched and cold. Her shoes were arranged neatly at the bedside. A single oil lamp still burned, its remaining oil proving it had been lit well past midnight. What the bailiff failed to record, and what the parish registers would leave out for nearly 60 years, was that 3 others scheduled to testify that week had also vanished by Friday. The riverbank below the courthouse had been dragged twice in silence before the judge indefinitely suspended the trial. The surviving records describe Delphine as 24, unmarried, fluent in French and English, and in possession of a ledger that no authority ever confessed to reading. That ledger, according to the sole person who claimed to have held it, listed the names of 17 men in the parish alongside the sums they had paid to make certain things and certain people disappear. Before we go further into Delphine's story and the courthouse at Pointe Coupee, please subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you won't miss what follows, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from, your state or city. Knowing your location transforms these tales from mere voices in the darkness into a conversation among strangers who have agreed for a brief while not to turn away. Now lean in close. What we are about to enter is not a ghost story. It is a record of what men do when they believe no one is keeping track, and what one woman did when she realized, sitting by an oil lamp in a locked room, that her only remaining weapon was the choice of how she would be remembered. To grasp what happened to Delphine, you must first understand the place that consumed her. Pointe Coupee was never a large settlement, even at its peak. It occupied a horseshoe bend of the Mississippi, roughly 40 miles downriver from Baton Rouge, where the bluffs gave way to cypress wetlands, and the August air grew so heavy that men claimed you could chew it between your teeth. The town was founded in the 1760s by French colonists who had drifted south from the Illinois country. By 1871, its population was a complex weave of old Creole families, formerly enslaved people who had remained on the plantations as workers, Cajun farmers from the interior, Irish dock workers who had arrived from New Orleans after the Civil War, and a handful of northern agents representing cotton factors in Natchez and Memphis. The parish courthouse stood atop a gentle rise, constructed from locally fired yellow brick that had already begun to erode at the edges. Its clock tower was the tallest structure for a full day's ride in every direction. On still nights, when the clock chimed, the sound carried to the far bank of the river, a slow, iron note that traveled across the water into the cypress groves, where listeners in the riverfront taverns felt it came from somewhere beneath the earth rather than above it. This was a land of levees and lantern, lit wharves, of sugar-cane rotting sweetly in the fields after harvest, of mosquitoes rising from the swamps in clouds so thick they left welts on horses. The roads from the interior were little more than wheel ruts that turned to black mud in the rain and fine gray dust in the summer. That dust settled on everything, on the shoulders of men's coats, on the windowsills of boarding houses, on the linen that washerwomen hung to dry behind the laundries at the town's southern end. It was also a land in the midst of a long and bitter reorganization. The war had ended only 6 years earlier, and the men who had once ruled Pointe Coupee were learning slowly and resentfully that their rule was no longer absolute. The parish housed a federal garrison of 12 soldiers in a requisitioned warehouse near the steamboat landing. It had a Republican sheriff imposed from Baton Rouge, a heavyset man who limped from a wound at Shiloh and whom no old family would invite to dinner. It had 3 newspapers, 2 of which printed in the careful, coded language of the Reconstruction press reminders of what had been and hints of what might return. Beneath all of this ran a quieter current of change. The rearrangement of money. The cotton trade was shifting. The sugar economy had been gutted. Old fortunes were being replaced by newer ones built on methods the old fortunes had also employed but had never been required to document in two separate sets of books. Delphine was not a native of the parish. She had arrived in 1867 from a small settlement farther south in the Bayou country, brought by an aunt who operated a boarding house on Rue St. Louis, 2 blocks from the courthouse square. The aunt, a widow named Celeste Arsenault, rented rooms almost exclusively to young women who worked in the town's shops and laundries. She ran her house with the quiet strictness of a convent. The parlor clock was never allowed to run slow. The front door was bolted at 9 o'clock. No male visitors were permitted beyond the front hallway. Every young woman who lived there understood, without explicit instruction, that maintaining a boarding house of respectable girls in Pointe Coupee in 1871 depended entirely on preserving appearances. And appearances, in Celeste's view, were not the opposite of truth, they were truth's outer armor. Delphine was slender. With her mother's dark hair and the pale gray eyes of a Norman grandfather she had never met. From that grandfather, she had inherited a habit of listening with her eyes half closed, a trait others often mistook for shyness, but was, in fact, deep attention. She supported herself through sewing, and by the spring of 1871, she had built a clientele that included the wives of cotton factors, the daughters of the parish judge, and 2 prominent women from the Catholic Charity Society. Her hands were quick and her mouth was quiet. In a town where nearly everyone believed they knew everyone else's business, she was known as someone who kept her own counsel. She was also, by all accounts, devout in a gentle and unobtrusive way. She attended 6 o'clock Mass on Sunday mornings at the small brick church behind the courthouse and brought communion to an elderly neighbor who could no longer walk. She had one suitor, a bookkeeper at the cotton warehouse named Etienne Pelletier, who had proposed twice and been gently refused both times, though she still walked with him along the levee on Sunday afternoons. Pelletier was a patient man of 26, with a soft brown beard and eyes that squinted from years of reading ledgers. He had told a friend at the warehouse in the winter of 1870 that he intended to ask Delphine once a year for as long as necessary, because he believed a woman who said no twice was not a woman who meant never, but merely a woman who meant not yet. Nothing else in the surviving descriptions of Delphine would have marked her as extraordinary. In nearly every visible way, she was an ordinary young woman of her class and station, which was, perhaps, exactly why someone chose her to hold the ledger. The ledger did not originally belong to Delphine. It had belonged to a man named Marius Robichaux, a cotton broker of middling reputation but considerable private wealth, who had died in February 1871 under circumstances the parish physician called sudden apoplexy, and several of the man's household servants later described privately as something closer to violent. Panicked poisoning. Robichaux had kept 2 sets of books for most of his adult life. One tracked his legitimate business, bales purchased, warehousing fees, shipments to New Orleans, debts owed to Baton Rouge banks. The other tracked a different kind of commerce, one that had begun modestly during the war, when men in the parish discovered that displaced persons lost property, and disputed titles created opportunities for those willing to handle certain matters without the burden of paperwork. By the time Robichaux died, the second ledger had grown to 183 pages. According to the only witness who ever described its contents in detail, it named 17 men in Pointe Coupee who had purchased services ranging from witness intimidation to discreet document destruction to the removal of people who had become inconvenient to the parish elite's business interests. The first ledger was found on Robichaux's desk the morning after his death. The second was not. His widow, a small, frightened woman named Madeleine, discovered it 3 weeks later wrapped in oilcloth beneath a loose floorboard in her late husband's study. After sitting with it for 2 nights, she carried it in a sewing basket to the boarding house of her cousin, Celeste Arsenault. She arrived at dusk in a plain black shawl and sat in Celeste's kitchen for nearly an hour without speaking, drinking cup after cup of coffee that had gone cold. Finally, she pushed the sewing basket across the table. She said only that she could no longer sleep with the thing in her house, that Celeste would understand when she opened it, and that she hoped Celeste would forgive her for bringing it, because there was no one else in the parish she trusted with so heavy a secret. Celeste, by her own later account, did not open the basket until Madeleine had left. When she did, she stood at her kitchen table for a long time, holding the oilcloth package, reading the first 3 pages by the light of a single candle. Then she rewrapped it, climbed the stairs to the top floor, and hid it in the cedar-lined linen chest at the foot of Delphine's bed. Delphine's room was the only one in the house with a working bolt on the door. Celeste had understood in that moment that she was not strong enough to carry the burden alone, and that the one person in her house who might be strong enough was the very person she most wanted to protect. She told no one what was inside, not even Delphine, or so Celeste later claimed. The events that put Delphine on the witness stand began in April, when a laborer named Isaac Green was found dead at the foot of the levee. He was a man of about 40 who had worked as a teamster for one of the old sugar plantations and had, in recent months, begun filing claims for wages unpaid since before emancipation. He had been a quiet man, a widower, a Methodist, a father of 3 grown daughters. He had visited the federal agent's office in Baton Rouge twice that winter, carrying carefully written statements he had dictated to a school teacher in exchange for a week's work on her woodpile. The parish authorities ruled his death a drowning. The deputy coroner's brief report noted that his pockets were empty, his boots missing, and the back of his skull showed an injury consistent with a fall against rocks in shallow water. 2 of his co-workers, both black freedmen named Solomon Reed and Marcus Freeman, came forward within a week to say that Green had been beaten behind the cotton warehouse on the night of his death and thrown into the river afterward. They said they had seen 3 white men standing over him in the lantern light, and that one of the 3 was the warehouse foreman, Jonas Perrin, whose family had been named in the published obituary of Marius Robichaux as among the late broker's closest business associates. Under ordinary circumstances in the parish, such a claim would have produced no indictment and no investigation. The sheriff might have listened or not. The deputy coroner might have filed or amended the report. Life would have gone on, but 1871 was not an ordinary year. A federal circuit judge named Horace Tremont had been appointed to oversee civil rights enforcement in the lower Mississippi districts, and Tremont was not from Louisiana. He was a Vermonter, a former Union colonel, a man in his 50s with a short gray beard and a trick knee from a musket ball at Spotsylvania. He believed, with the narrow and unshakable conviction of a New England Congregationalist, that the reconstruction of the South depended on the willingness of federal courts to convict white men for crimes they had previously committed without consequence. Tremont did not shout. He did not make speeches. He did not give newspaper interviews. He simply wrote and issued subpoenas with a steady, methodical patience that his clerk said reminded them of a man carving a channel into stone with a penknife. Tremont scheduled a grand jury for the first week of July and subpoenaed not only the 2 witnesses who had come forward, but anyone in the parish known to have dealt with Marius Robichaux, on the theory that Robichaux's second ledger, rumors of which had reached Baton Rouge, might contain information about a pattern of organized violence against freedmen in the cotton trade. Delphine Boissou's name appeared on the subpoena list, because Celeste Arsenault's name had appeared first. When the federal marshal knocked on the boarding house door in the hot drizzle of a June afternoon, Celeste, terrified and ill with a fever that had started the night before, pointed down the hallway and said that her niece was the one who could speak to what was kept in the linen chest. And so, in the last week of June 1871, a 24-year-old seamstress with no living parents and no surviving brothers became the only person in Pointe Coupee who could place a ledger on the record and name. One by one, the men who had paid Marius Robichaux to make things and people disappear. By then, she had already read it. She had read it against her aunt's unspoken wishes, sitting by the oil lamp in her room with the door bolted and the shutters closed, listening to the small sounds of the house settling around her. The creak of the staircase, the soft tick of the parlor clock 2 floors below, the occasional bark of a dog from the levee road. She read all 183 pages in 7 nights. On the first night, she read only the opening pages, then set the ledger down, went to bed and lay awake until dawn. On the second night, she read for 3 hours and went downstairs at midnight to make herself tea. Celeste, who had also been unable to sleep, came to the kitchen door and looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Neither said anything. Delphine carried her tea back upstairs. Celeste returned to her bedroom. On the third night, Delphine began keeping notes in a small cloth-bound book she kept at the bottom of her sewing basket, written in a personal shorthand that combined French abbreviations with a cipher of her own invention, substituting letters of the alphabet with the numerical positions of saints' days in the liturgical calendar. By the 5th night, she had begun to recognize patterns. By the 6th, she had begun to recognize names, and when she closed the ledger on the 7th night, she understood, with the clarity of someone who had grown up in a country where certain lessons were taught young, that she was now the most dangerous woman in the parish. The only thing protecting her was that most of the 17 men did not yet know she existed. She did not sleep at all that 7th night. She sat in the wooden chair by the window, with the shutters closed and the lamp sputtering, watching the faint seam of gray slowly grow between the slats as dawn rose over the river. She thought about her mother, who had died when Delphine was 11 of the fever that swept through the Bayou in the autumn of 1858, who had taught her to sew by candlelight and who, on the last night of her life, had held Delphine's hand and told her that the one thing no one could ever take from her was the careful attention of her own mind. She thought about her father, who had died at Shiloh, whose face she could no longer clearly remember, but whose voice she could still summon in quiet moments. A slow, deep voice that had always spoken French at home and English only at the market. She thought about the walks along the levee with Etienne Pelletier, about 6 o'clock Mass at the small brick church, about the elderly neighbor to whom she brought communion. And she understood that none of those things would protect her. The men named in the ledger had already demonstrated repeatedly that hesitation was not among their habits. And she understood something else, which took her by surprise. She was not afraid. She was something else, something colder and quieter than fear. In the days that followed, she would come to recognize it as the particular stillness of a person who has made a decision before she knows she has made it. The deposition was scheduled for the morning of July 5th. The marshal came for her at dawn in a light summer rain, the kind of rain that in Louisiana smells of cypress bark and iron. He found her door locked from within. Celeste unlocked it with her own key, a thin brass key that had hung on a black ribbon around her neck for as long as anyone could remember. The two of them stood in the doorway and looked at what the room contained and did not contain. The bed had been slept in, or at least disturbed. The coverlet was pulled back at one corner. The pillow bore the shallow impression of a head that had rested there for at least an hour. The supper on the small pine table was cold but untouched, a plate of rice and red beans with a single piece of bread broken in half, and a pewter cup of water beside it, still full. Her shoes, the black leather walking boots she wore to Mass, were placed side by side at the foot of the bed, as if she had intended to put them on in the morning, and had at some point during the night decided not to. The oil lamp on the writing desk still had a thin film of smoke on its chimney, meaning it had burned long past her usual bedtime. Her second best dress, the green one she had pressed the afternoon before to wear to the courthouse, hung on the back of the door, still pressed, sleeves smooth, collar sharp, a small sprig of lavender tucked into the breast pocket. Her Bible lay open on the dresser, face down on the book of Judith. And on the desk, in the center of the blotter, was a single sheet of paper on which she had written, in her careful schoolmistress hand, she would not take another name, followed by 3 initials that no one in the room recognized, and nothing else. The linen chest at the foot of the bed stood open. The ledger was gone, and so was Delphine. No window was broken. No floorboard was disturbed. The shutters were locked from inside with a small iron pin dropped through the latch, as they were every night before she went to bed. The bolt on the door had been thrown from inside, and that bolt, as anyone who had ever tried to open it knew, was stiff with age and made a particular sound when thrown, a sound that could be heard from 2 rooms away. The only way out of that room, if she had left it alive, was through a door she could not have locked behind her. Yet the room was empty. The marshal, Henry Callahan, who had fought with the Irish Brigade at Antietam, stood in the doorway for nearly a full minute before speaking. He was a tall man, gaunt in the way older Irishmen become gaunt, with a long graying beard and eyes the color of wet slate. A scar ran from his hairline above his left eye down into his beard, and he had a habit, when thinking, of rubbing that scar with the side of his thumb. He rubbed it now. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, addressed to Celeste. He asked whether she was certain her niece had been in the room when she retired for the night. Celeste said she was certain. Her voice, she later recalled, felt as though it were coming from the next room. She said she had brought Delphine a cup of chicory coffee at 9 o'clock, and they had spoken for perhaps 15 minutes. Delphine had been calm but pale, and had said she would sleep well because she had made her peace with God and with the testimony she was about to give. Celeste said she had heard her niece bolt the door after her, because that bolt was stiff and made its distinctive sound. She had gone to bed herself just after 10. The house had been quiet all night, and she had not heard a single footstep on the stairs. Callahan walked around the room twice. He looked under the bed. He tested the shutters. He stood on a chair and examined the ceiling. He lifted the Bible from the dresser and looked beneath it, then set it back exactly as he had found it, face down on the book of Judith. Then he asked Celeste to leave the room, and he stood alone inside for a long time. Celeste, waiting in the hallway, heard him do 2 things: open the linen chest and close it again, and murmur very softly something in Irish. A word she did not understand, a word she later believed was a prayer. When he came out, his face was the color of tallow. He said only that this was no longer a matter for the marshal's office. It was a matter for Judge Tremont. That night, 2 other witnesses on Tremont's list disappeared. Marcus Freeman, the freedman who had worked beside Isaac Green on the plantation and had come forward to describe the beating behind the warehouse, was last seen at a small tavern on the riverfront at 10:30, walking out into the rain with a friend who said he saw Freeman turn north along the levee path and then lost sight of him in the darkness. Freeman did not arrive home. His wife, Cora, waited all night with a lantern in the window. At first light, she went out along the path with a cousin, calling his name. They found nothing but the soft black mud and the deep silence of the cypress. By mid-morning, 3 more men had joined the search. By noon, one of Freeman's shoes was found at the river's edge, half sunk in the mud with the laces still tied. No body was ever recovered. The other witness, a white shopkeeper named Edward Lacombe, who had done business with Robichaux and had been prepared to testify about certain payments recorded in the first ledger that had been intended to conceal the second, simply failed to open his store on the morning of July 6th. His clerk, a 14-year-old boy named Thomas who had worked there for 2 years, found the store locked, the cash drawer untouched, and a half-drunk cup of tea on the counter behind the ribbon rack. Lacombe's hat and coat hung on their hooks. His horse was still in the stable. The rear door of the shop was bolted from inside, just as Delphine's had been. The clerk, standing in that small back room in the gray morning light, said afterward that he had the sudden and unshakable feeling that he was standing in a place where someone had been only minutes before, and that whoever had taken them had been careful and patient and unhurried. By Friday, Judge Tremont had lost 3 of his 4 witnesses. By Saturday, the grand jury had been dismissed. By the following Tuesday, the second ledger, the reason for the entire proceeding, was officially considered by parish authorities to have never existed at all. Decades later, in the years after the First World War, a young woman named Antoinette Duval came to Pointe Coupee from New Orleans to settle the estate of an aunt who had died without direct heirs. The aunt had been a daughter of Celeste Arsenault, and the boarding house on Rue St. Louis had passed to her, and from her in 1919 to Antoinette. The house had been shuttered for 2 years by then. The rooms were dusty. The kitchen smelled faintly of mice and of coffee grounds left in a tin on a shelf for a decade. Antoinette was 26, slender, with her grandmother's pale gray eyes and her mother's dark hair, trained as a schoolteacher, engaged to a printer she had met at a lecture on the suffrage movement in Chicago. She had come south for a month to sort through what remained. Most of the house was sold or given away within the first 3 weeks. But in the attic, in a locked tin trunk that had not been opened in at least 40 years, she found a bundle of papers tied with black ribbon. Among those papers was a letter sealed in wax, addressed in a careful schoolmistress hand to a person who did not exist. The envelope reads simply as, "To the one who asks." Antoinette sat on the attic floor, in the dusty amber light streaming through the small round window. She turned the envelope over in her hands for nearly 5 minutes before opening it. The letter was dated July 3, 1871, 2 days before Delphine's disappearance. It was written in French and ran to nearly 7 pages. It began with an account of how the ledger had come into the boarding house, how Delphine had been told to keep it in her linen chest, and how she had, against her aunt's explicit instructions, read it. It described what she had read. It named 6 of the 17 men, and it set out, in the plain and methodical prose of a woman trained to keep household accounts, what each of them had paid Marius Robichaux for, and when, and how much. It described the death of a dockworker in 1866, whose body had been weighted and sunk in the river off the old sugar wharf. It named the 2 men who had paid $42 for the disposal, the man who had received the payment, and the exact night on which the weighting had been done. It described the forced removal of a freedman family in 1868, whose claim to land near the bayou had been inconveniently supported by a written deed, and the arson of the small cabin in which that family had lived. It named the 3 men who had purchased the arson, the 2 men who had carried the lanterns, and the 4-year-old child who had died of smoke inhalation in a back room. It described the disappearance of a young midwife in 1869 whose only crime had been to tell 3 pregnant women that the doctor they had been sent to was a drunk who had killed 2 patients. It described the method by which that midwife had been silenced, a staged elopement, a forged letter to her family, and a shallow grave in a cane field 12 miles north of town. Each of these accounts was set down without elaboration or outrage, as though Delphine understood that her only protection against being dismissed as hysterical was to write like a clerk. Then, near the end of the letter, the tone shifted. The last 2 pages were something else. They described a visit she had received on the evening of July 1st, 4 days before her deposition. A man had come to the boarding house at dusk. He had not given his name, but Celeste had shown him up to the parlor, and Delphine had been summoned. The man was not a stranger. She recognized him as the eldest son of one of the men named in the ledger, a planter from the north end of the parish whose family had lost most of its land in the war and was rebuilding its fortune through the cotton trade. He was perhaps 35, well dressed in a dark gray frock coat of a cut that had arrived from New Orleans that spring, quiet in his manner, clean-shaven, with hands that showed no labor and a gold ring on his smallest finger. He had, Delphine wrote, the particular calm of a man who had made a decision he did not expect to be disputed. He sat across from her in the small parlor, in the ladder back chair by the fireplace. Celeste brought coffee and then, at a glance from the man, withdrew. He waited until the parlor door closed behind her. Then he spoke. He told her that he understood she had been subpoenaed, that he understood she was in possession of certain papers, and that he had come to propose a transaction. He said he could see, from the quality of her sewing and the modesty of her circumstances, that she was a woman of limited means and considerable intelligence, and that such a combination was rarely rewarded in the world as it presently existed. He said he was authorized by persons he did not name to offer her $2,000 in gold and passage to any city she chose, east or west, along with a letter of introduction to respectable families in that city who would receive her as a gentlewoman of reduced circumstances. He named the families. The names were familiar. One was the Boston family of a woman for whom Delphine had, 4 months earlier, made a wedding gown. He said that in exchange she was to hand over the ledger, withdraw from her testimony on grounds of conscience, and leave the parish within 48 hours. He said the alternative was one she would not enjoy, though he phrased it with great delicacy. He said the parish had, he believed, already demonstrated what could happen to persons who insisted on carrying burdens that did not belong to them. He paused. He looked at her with something like regret. He said he wanted her to understand that the offer was a kindness, and that it was the last kindness that would be offered. Then he waited. She wrote that he waited with a patience she found more frightening than any shouting could have been. Because he was not a hot-tempered man, and he was not a cruel man in the way a beast is cruel. He was simply a man prepared to destroy her with the same administrative efficiency with which he would have foreclosed on a farm. Delphine wrote that she looked at him for a long time, and that she felt, for the first time in her adult life, the full weight of what it meant to be a woman in a place like Pointe Coupee in a year like 1871. And then she wrote that she understood in that moment that the 17 men in the ledger were not a conspiracy so much as a system, and that the system was older than any of them and would survive all of them, whether she took the gold and fled or handed over the ledger and stayed. The system would not be dismantled by her testimony or by her silence. She wrote that she thought, briefly and with a kind of distant amusement, about how she would describe the moment to Pelletier, if she could ever describe it to anyone. And she understood that she could not, and that the inability to tell him was itself a kind of wound, a small, cold wound she could not yet name. And then she wrote something that changed the entire meaning of this case. She wrote that she asked the man a single question, who had sent him. He smiled very slightly and said that no one had sent him. He had come on his own because the other 16 were prepared to take measures he considered distasteful, and he had wished to spare her and himself that distastefulness. He said the others would come on the night of the 4th, if she had not gone by then, and that what they would do, she would not survive. Delphine thanked him for the warning. She asked him to leave, and he left. She wrote that she sat in the parlor alone for nearly an hour afterward, and that she realized, with a peculiar and almost weightless calm, that she had been given not a choice between life and death, but a choice between two different kinds of disappearance. To take the gold was to disappear as a person who had once mattered. To stay was to disappear as a body, and to do the third thing. The thing she had begun to plan as she sat there alone in the parlor while the clock in the tower struck 11, was to disappear as something else entirely. The letter ended there, with a signature and a date, and with a note that she had written it in case the worst should come to pass and someone, someday, should want to know what she had chosen and why. When Antoinette Duval read the letter in 1919, she did not immediately tell anyone. She was 26. She had grown up in New Orleans hearing rumors of a cousin who had vanished in the years after the war. But her mother had always refused to speak of it, and the rumors had never included names. Antoinette sat with the letter for 3 days. She read it a second time and a third. On the 4th morning, she walked down to the parish courthouse, carrying the letter in her handbag, and asked to see the records of the grand jury that had been called in July of 1871. The clerk, a young man with oiled hair and a celluloid collar, told her politely that no such grand jury had ever convened. Antoinette produced a printed reference to it from a published memoir of Judge Horace Tremont, who had died in Vermont in 1903. The clerk excused himself for nearly half an hour. When he returned, he was accompanied by a man who introduced himself as the parish attorney. A thin, careful man in his 60s, whose family name Antoinette recognized with a jolt she hoped did not show on her face. It was one of the 6 names in her cousin's letter. The parish attorney was Cordis. He invited her into his office. He offered her coffee. He listened to her describe the letter without asking to see it. He did not write anything down. Then he told her, in the gentle and regretful tone of a man explaining that a roof cannot be repaired because the timbers are rotten through, that the documents she was looking for had been destroyed in a courthouse fire in 1884, that the memoir she had cited was known to contain inaccuracies, and that the family name of the young woman she was inquiring about did not appear in any parish record he could locate. He suggested, with the same gentleness, that perhaps her cousin had run away with a man and started a new life elsewhere, as young women sometimes did, and that it would be a kindness to the memory of the family to let the matter rest. He walked her to the door. He shook her hand. His hand was dry and cool, the hand of a man who had never done physical labor in his life. On the street outside in the bright October light, Antoinette understood 2 things at once. The first was that the parish attorney had known her cousin's name before she had spoken it. The second was that the letter in her handbag was now the most dangerous object in Pointe Coupee, just as the ledger had been 48 years before, and the patience that had waited for Delphine in a darkened parlor in 1871 was, in its slow and institutional way, still waiting. She walked back to the boarding house by a different route than the one she had taken in the morning. She did not stop at the hotel where she had left her midday meal on the table. She did not speak to anyone she passed. She packed her trunk that afternoon. She left on the first train the following morning. She never set foot in Louisiana again for the rest of her life. Antoinette took the letter with her to New Orleans, and from New Orleans to Chicago, where she married the printer in 1922 and raised 2 daughters. The letter sat for another 40 years in a safe deposit box at a bank on Dearborn Street. She told her husband about it once, in 1931, on a winter evening when snow was piling against the kitchen window and the radio was playing a program about the Scopes trial. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, he thought the letter belonged to history, and that the right thing would be to give it someday to a historian who knew what to do with it. But the right historian, they agreed, did not yet exist. The country was not ready. The safe deposit box would wait. It was her younger daughter, Rose, who finally brought it to the attention of a historian in 1963. Rose had read an article in a national magazine about the records of the federal Reconstruction courts in Louisiana and the peculiar number of witnesses who had never lived to testify. The historian, a young assistant professor at Tulane named James Hodges, flew to Chicago within a week. He was 31, a graduate of the University of North Carolina, the son of a Methodist minister. He had been looking for a case like this for 3 years without knowing it was the case he was looking for. He read the letter twice in Rose's kitchen with a cup of coffee in front of him that went cold. Then he asked her very carefully whether the family had kept any other papers from the aunt's estate. Rose said there was a trunk in the basement that no one had opened in her lifetime. She and Hodges went down the basement stairs together and pried the trunk open with a screwdriver. Inside, beneath 3 folded quilts and a bundle of tax receipts from the 1890s, they found the second ledger of Marius Robichaux. It was exactly as Delphine had described it. 183 pages, 17 names, dates, sums, descriptions in the brisk commercial shorthand of a cotton broker of what had been purchased and on whose behalf. Hodges sat on the basement floor and read it for 2 hours without speaking. The furnace clicked on and off. A neighbor's dog barked somewhere outside. At one point, Rose brought down a fresh pot of coffee and set it on a wooden crate beside him. He did not look up. When he finally looked up, he said in a voice Rose later remembered as almost apologetic that the names in the ledger belonged to families still prominent in Louisiana. The publication of the ledger would not result in any prosecutions because every man named in it had been dead for half a century. What they were holding was not evidence but history, and history, in a country as young and as reluctant as the United States, was sometimes the only justice the dead ever received. But here is where the story turns. What Hodges published in 1964, in a small academic monograph that sold fewer than 300 copies and was never reprinted, was not only the ledger and the letter. It was also the account of what the ledger revealed about the night of July 4, 1871, in the room on Rue St. Louis. The ledger contained, as it turned out, one final entry. It had been written in a hand that was not Robichaux's. Robichaux had been dead for 5 months, but in a hand that matched exactly an entry Robichaux had made 3 years earlier on behalf of a client who had signed his own name in a contract later filed with the parish records. The final entry was dated July